Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm continuing with my exposition of the third series of items in my so-called Workshop 2022, dealing with apparent difficulties that are actually in the text. We come now to the question of how did Judah die? This is a simple one. This is not really difficult. We have two different statements, Matthew 27, 5 through 8, and Acts 1, 18 and 19. In the New King James Version, according to Matthew, he went and hanged himself. While according to Acts, quote, falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his entrails gushed out. From the context, it is clear that this happened at the field that he purchased posthumously. Now then, for a successful hanging, there must be enough altitude so that when the end of the rope is reached, the victim is still in the air. Okay, you get that? But to fall headlong, there has to be a cliff, and you would have to dive off. Putting the two accounts together, we may understand that there must have been a tree near the edge of the cliff with a branch reaching out beyond the edge. Judah tied a cord around that branch and his neck and jumped. Either the cord or the branch broke, and the impact was sufficient to split him open. Matthew states that it was actually the chief priests who bought the field using the money that Judas had thrown on the temple floor. So Judas made the purchase posthumously, if we may say it that way. Now we come to a more difficult case. This one is a genuinely difficult case. It's the question of Canaan, number 2 in the Lord's genealogy, going way back to the beginning. It's Luke 3:36. Here we have Stephen's defense against. No. This is not Stephen. This is Mary's genealogy. And what is in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 12. In Luke 3, we have, beginning with verse 35, of Serug, of Ru, of Peleg, of Eber, of Shelah, of Canaan, of Arphaxad, of Shem, of Noah, of Lamech. The Greek text does not have son of. That's an unwarranted addition that the translations edition of the versions add. There are several spelling variations that together are tested by about 1% of the Greek manuscripts, but 99% of the manuscripts have precisely Canaan. Apparently, only 2 manuscripts omit the name. Papyrus 75, and that's probable. It's not absolutely clear. And Codex D, or Visa. But no printed text follows their lead. So then there's no reasonable doubt that Luke, in fact, wrote that Shelah was fathered by Canaan, not Arphaxad, as it is in Genesis. Okay. Now, this Canaan has been widely used to justify treating the genealogies in Genesis like accordions. If one name has been demonstrably left out in the Genesis account, then who knows how many others were also left out. This Canaan is also used to deny the validity of constructing a strict chronology based on the time spans given in the Genesis genealogies. Okay, where did Luke get this information? The Septuagint contains Canaan in Genesis 11:12, but is so different from the Masoretic text here that it looks like fiction. Recall, please, that the Septuagint we know and use is based on codices Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus that were produced centuries after Luke. In fact, I hold it's more likely that our Septuagint is based on Luke than vice versa. Okay, that still leaves the question, where did Luke get it? I understand that Luke obtained the information about this Canaan from records existing in his day, and being correct information, was led by the Holy Spirit to include it in his gospel. Just like Jude, who quoted Enoch, as I've already said, that was in his day. We don't have it there. The last reported one in Hebrew was the 13th century of AD. So we have no copy of Luke's source. I have a footnote here that I want to read. Let us recall Luke's stated purpose in writing. Seemed good to me also, most excellent Theophilus, having taken careful note of everything from above, to write to you with precision and in sequence, so that you may know the certainty of the things in which you were instructed. Luke chapter 1 and verse 3 mainly. So, given his stated purpose in writing, Luke's account needs to be historically accurate. So I take it that the Holy Spirit did in fact guide Luke to include Canaan number 2. I will argue the same for Joram below and so on, but let's not get into that. Coming back now, I want to acknowledge Dr. Floyd N. Jones. This brief note was inspired by his discussion of the subject that you'll find in his chronology of the Old Testament. My copy here is the 14th edition. Let me say that book, Chronology of the Old Testament, comes close to solving all the alleged numerical discrepancies in the Old Testament, at least as I see it. I recommend it to any of you. I believe you can download it free from his website nowadays. Otherwise, you can buy it. However, that said, I owe the first idea to Dr. Floyd Jones, but the explanation that follows now that I'm going to give is original with me. That is, if anyone else has proposed it, I don't know. Now let's go back to the exact wording of Genesis chapter 11, verses 12 and 13. Quote, Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Selah. After he begot Selah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. End quote. The verb begot requires that Selah be a blood descendant of Arphaxad, not adopted. He could be a grandson, the son of a son of Arphaxad, or even a great-grandson, etc., except that in this case, the time frame only has room for one intervening generation, and even so, it has to be squished. The plain meaning of the formula in the text, W lived X years and begot Y. After W begot Y, he lived Z years, is that W was X years old when Y was born. Okay, that clear? Just by the way, it follows that this formula destroys the so-called accordion gambit. There were precisely 130 years between Adam and Seth, 105 years between Seth and Enosh, 90 years between Enosh and Canaan, and so on. That is the first Canaan. Okay. I take the clear meaning of the Hebrew text to be that Arphaxad was 35 years old when Selah was born, whatever we may decide is true about Canaan too. Let's try to imagine the situation in the years immediately following the flood. After the flood, the name of the game was to replenish the earth. Indeed, the divine command was, quote, be fruitful and multiply, end quote, Genesis 9, verse 1. So, whom could Noah's grandsons marry? Obviously, their cousins, Noah's granddaughters. There would be an urgency to reproduce. Thus, the girls would be married off at puberty, and the boys would not be wasting around either. The women would be giving birth as often as they possibly could. Really, think about it. The absolute top priority would be to increase the number of people. Arphaxad was born 2 years after the flood, but his wife could have been born a year or two earlier. The sacred text is clear to the effect that only 8 souls entered the ark. But some of the women could have conceived during the flood. They were there for a year, remember? Thus, our facts it could have fathered Canaan number 2, when he was 17 or 18 years old, and similarly, Canaan number 2 could have fathered Selah when he was 17 or 18 years old. In this way, our facts it could be said to have begotten Selah when he was 35. Canaan could have died early or been passed over in Genesis because the time span did not constitute a generation, or maybe both. Or as things got back to normal, culturally speaking, the haste with which our Arphaxad and Canaan procreated might have been viewed as unseemly. The expedient of omitting Canaan would make the account more, quote, normal, unquote, while preserving precision as to the elapsed time. However, Luke would be correct in saying that Selah was of Canaan, who was of Arphaxad. I take it that Selah was Arphaxad's grandson. In any case, the messianic line was passed on precisely by Selah. Without Luke's record, I, for one, would never have stopped to consider what must have happened immediately following the flood. The absolute priority must have been to increase the number of people. Sure, stop and think about it. Just 8 of you, you've got to get more. The sooner the better. Now I come to another question. This one has been, you'll find all kinds of books and articles about this. How long was Jesus' body in the tomb? Like I say, many books and articles. The principal difficulty derives from Jesus' own use of several different expressions to describe that time. Referring to the time period between his death and the resurrection, he himself said, quote, the third day, end quote, quote, after 3 days, end quote, and, quote, 3 days and 3 nights, end quote. A careful look at all the relevant passages makes clear that the 3 phrases are not equal candidates. Consider, there's only one instance of 3 days and 3 nights to be found, and it's to be found in Matthew 12, verse 40. Jesus cites the experience of Jonah 1:17, and says that he, that's Jesus, will have a similar experience. That we are in the presence of a Hebrew idiom will become apparent from what follows. There are just 2 instances of, quote, after 3 days, end quote, to be found in Mark 8:31 and Matthew 27:63. In Mark, Jesus is cited in an indirect quote, as Jesus tells the disciples what is going to happen to him. In Matthew, Jesus is quoted by the Jewish leaders as they ask Pilate to guard the tomb. But please notice that in verse 64, they, that is those leaders, go on to say, quote, until the 3rd day, end quote. So the 2 phrases would appear to be synonymous. As for the 3rd day, there are 11 direct instances plus 3 related ones. I say that proper hermeneutic procedure requires that we interpret the few in terms of the many, and not the reverse. In Matthew 16:21, 17:23, 20:19, Mark 9:31, 10:34, Luke 9:22, 18:33, Jesus is telling the disciples what is going to happen to him. In Luke 24:7, the angel quotes Jesus to the woman and to the women in the empty tomb. In Luke 24:46, the resurrected Jesus is speaking with the disciples. In Acts 14:40, Peter is preaching to Cornelius. In 1 Corinthians 15:4, Paul makes a statement. Those are the 11 direct instances. In Luke 24:21, Cleopas says to Jesus, quote, today is the 3rd day since these things happened. These things refers to the to the crucifixion, and the today includes the resurrection, since he cites the women. In John 2:19, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it." In Luke 13:32, Jesus sends a message to Herod, "The third day I will be perfected." Those are the three related instances for a total of 14. Well, the last one is marginal, so make it 13. Let me see here. Now there's a textual problem, but it's one of those things, less than 1%. I suppose that all human cultures have the tendency to think that their way of seeing things is right, and all the others are wrong. But what to do when conflicts arise? When attempting to understand a given event, it is the culture within which it happened that must be respected. Jews and Brazilians handle time differently than do Westerners in general. Here in Brazil, after church, we often say, "I will see you in 8 days," which means next Sunday. The day in which you are is included in the number. And we have biblical basis. Consider John 20:26. Well, after 8 days, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. 8 days from when? Then at evening on the first day of the week, the doors being locked, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the middle, John 20:19. The first day of the week is Sunday. The use of that indicates that it was Resurrection Sunday. With few exceptions, the Church Universal has always understood that Jesus rose on a Sunday, as the text plainly indicates. In John 20:26, after 8 days means the next Sunday. To the Western mind, the use of after is misleading. After 8 days would place one in the 9th day. But we are in the presence of a Hebrew idiom, wherein after 8 days is the 8th day. This is plainly indicated in Matthew 27, verses 63 and 64, where after 3 days equals until the 3rd day. That's the Pharisees saying that. But as already noted, the beginning day is included in the number. So after 8 days equals the 8th day, equals 7 consecutive solar days of elapsed time, although the first and last solar day may not be equal 24 hours. That is not necessarily included. Now please, let's consider Luke 23, verse 53 through chapter 24, verse 1. Quote, "Then he took it down," that's Joseph of Arimathea. "Then he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock where no one had ever been laid." It was a preparation day. The Sabbath was drawing near. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed along, and they saw the tomb and how his body was placed there. Then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes. But they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. Then on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb carrying the spices that they had prepared, along with the others. After the women observed the burial, they rested for 1 day. Sabbath is singular. They took their spices to the tomb on Sunday. It follows that Jesus was buried on Friday. Jesus was in the tomb for part of Friday, all of Saturday, and part of Sunday. He rose, quote, "the 3rd day," end quote. Mark 14, verse 1 may also be of interest. Quote, "It was 2 days before the Passover and the unleavened bread." According to a careful analysis of the sequence of events that made up the last week, at this point it was late Tuesday afternoon, probably after 6 p.m. Adding 2 days takes us up to 6 p.m. on Thursday. But the proceedings in the upper room began after 6 p.m. on that Thursday, which to the Jews was already Friday. Therefore, Jesus died on a Friday. We take it that 3 days and 3 nights was an idiomatic expression that could refer to 3 solar days represented by some part of each, but in sequence. In this case, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Okay, that's what I have to say about how long Jesus was in his body, that is, was in the tomb. Now we come to a really serious one. This one has destroyed the faith of some people. I'm now going to go to the Old Testament, to 1 Samuel 13 and verse 1, and I'm going to talk about the preservation of the Hebrew text. I will start with a bit of personal experience. When I was a new student in my THM program, one of the prime movers in the Majority Text Vineyard was in his last year, and we worked together in the seminary kitchen. Our tongues wagged about as fast as our hands moved. We were both single, and there was a place to eat for the single students. So our tongues wagged about as fast as our hands moved. We did a lot of talking, mostly about things text critical and theological. In those pristine years, he, that is the other one, was a firm believer in the divine preservation of both the Hebrew and Greek Testaments to the letter. In due time, I came to Brazil as a missionary, and he continued in his teaching career. Every furlough, back then field terms were usually 5 years, not so much now maybe, back then, I would touch base with him and compare notes. On one of those occasions, I forget which one it was, when the subject of divine preservation came up, he opened the Bible to 1 Samuel 13:1 and affirmed that the original wording of that verse had been irretrievably lost by preservation. Well, now, what he did to me, someone else had done to him, and so on into the night. I rather imagine that this verse has come to represent a difficulty in the thinking of not a few people who would like to believe in the divine preservation of the text, but, well, since I still believed in preservation at that time, and I continue to do so, his gesture, that is that colleague, his gesture gave me pause. Could he possibly be correct? So I sat down and studied the situation, including an inquiry to the local synagogue. There was a synagogue just across the street from the seminary grounds where I was. Very nice. So here is my conclusion. Now comes my conclusion after having studied the matter. The New King James Version renders 1 Samuel 13:1 and 2 like this, quote, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the mountains of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent away, every man to his tent. End quote. The New International Version, in the first verse, it is quite different. It reads like this. Saul was, you have a little bracket, 30, close bracket, years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel, bracket, 40, dash, bracket, 2 years. A footnote informs the reader that the bracketed words are not in the Hebrew text. Well, an uninitiated layperson who compares the two versions would easily conclude that they were translating completely different texts. But such is not the case. The Hebrew text is one without variant, no variance in the Hebrew text. The problem lies in the interpretation. An interlinear, morpheme by morpheme rendering of the first verse looks like this. This is my own interlinear rendering. Son of a year, wherever more than one word is needed to translate the Hebrew, I join the words with dashes. Son of a year, that's one word in Hebrew. Saul, in his reigning, and 2 years he reigned over Israel. Except, of course, that Hebrew is read from right to left. Okay, you know that. The confusion arises in that this became a formula used in the summary statement about a king's reign. A son of X years was Y in his reigning, that is, when he began to reign. And he reigned Z years. The formula usually occurs at the end of a king's history, but sometimes at the beginning. Of course, any attempt to apply that formula in 1 Samuel 13, verse 1, is ridiculous. Obviously, Saul could not have been 1 year old when he began to reign, and just as obviously, he reigned more than 2 years. Unfortunately, the New International Version, others have insisted on imposing the formula on this verse, inventing the 30 and the 40, so as not to have complete nonsense. Parenthesis, this also has the unfortunate effect of contradicting Acts 13, verse 21, that affirms that Saul reigned 40 years, not 42, close parenthesis. They weren't thinking about that. I suppose people who did the NIV and so on, that they have convinced themselves that the original numbers have disappeared from the text, having been irretrievably lost during the process of transmission. Okay. Let us look carefully at the context of chapter 13 and verse 1, 1 Samuel. To begin, Saul being the very first king of Israel, such a formula would not yet be in use. There had been no occasion to write of the beginning and length of reigns. There hadn't been any. Then in the context, this is not the place for a summary statement. It is neither the beginning nor the end of the history of Saul's reign. And that's where that formula goes, either one or the other. In 1 Samuel 10:24, he was publicly installed as king. Since he was the first, there was no precedent, no established procedure. In chapter 11, Saul defeats the Ammonites and is confirmed in the kingship, verse 15. In chapter 12, Samuel defends his ministry and gives a lesson in history. Chapter 13 resumes Saul's story and starts by saying when he established a standing army in the second year of his reign. I invite special attention to the concluding statement of verse 2. Quote, the rest of the people he sent away every man to his tent, end quote. Look, to be sent away, they had to be there, all right? Okay? Be there. Be where? In Gilgal, chapter 11, verse 15, where Samuel's discourse, chapter 12, also took place. It was part of the occasion. According to chapter 11, verse 9, Saul had mobilized 330,000 men against the Ammonites. And I imagine most of them had accompanied Samuel and Saul to Gilgal. So, chapter 13, verses 1 and 2 is a continuation of what happened at Gilgal. And verse 1 absolutely cannot be a summary statement about Saul's total reign. No way. Of the 330,000 that had been mobilized against Ammon, Saul chose 3,000 to be a standing army and sent the rest home. Perhaps the lack of a standing army had encouraged the Ammonites to get frisky. The news that Israel now had a standing army would serve as a deterrent. I take the point of chapter 13 and verse 1 to be that Saul had a full year behind him. So these events at Gilgal took place during his second year. I've studied a bit of Hebrew, but it is not my forte, but I would paraphrase our verse something like this. Saul had reigned for a full year over Israel, and it was during his second year that he chose for himself 3,000 men and so on. A colleague who did major in Hebrew, whose forte is Hebrew, agrees with me about this. No, that's right. Oh, I reject as unfounded the allegation that some of the original wording of 1 Samuel 13:1 has been lost. I reject it peremptorily. And the New International Version, etc., does a considerable disservice to the kingdom of God here. What they did was bad. What they did was wrong. They absolutely should not have done that. they should have followed the example of King James and the King James that translates it correctly. Oh well. All right, that is what I have for this video. I have just one more video on this series, which is talking about difficulties. I have 5 more difficulties that I want to talk about, but we will save those until the next video. Thanks for watching, and God bless.